So first I want to introduce you to Don Letts. Don has been around. He's been around the block too many times to mention.
Yeah, it's true. I'm as old as rock and roll, folks. But I ain't complaining.
Now Don has been, he was very involved with the whole kind of cross-pollination between reggae and punk, which we're going to get into as we get closer. But how did your whole love of music start?
Oh man, how did my love of music start? I'm a black man, it's in my DNA. No, but joking aside, I mean, you know, in a lot of Western culture, music is something that kids do. But for a lot of people on this planet, it's an integral part of their culture. The kids do it, the parents do it, the grandparents do it. I mean, my dad had a sound system in Jamaica. Not like the sound systems you guys know today. I mean, they weren't smoking weed, they were carrying Bibles. But it was a way for the people to congregate and exchange ideas. And my dad's name was St. Ledger Letts. And St. Ledger is the name of a bloody horse race. But his sound system was called Duke Letts Supersonic Sound. So as much of a cliche as it sounds, it was just all around me.
And that's how you
an integral part of my life, I've got to say.
And what kinds of music?
Well, my dad, like a lot of old Jamaicans, they'd listen to Nat King Cole. They'd listen to a guy called Brooke Benton. You ain't gonna know any of these people. But another thing that Jamaicans love was country and western. They loved country and western music, which is a real kind of weird anomaly. And the emerging reggae groups, people like Toots and all that stuff. Because reggae, as you guys know it, really didn't start till like, I don't know, early 70s. You know, before that you had ska, you had rocksteady, you had blue beat, which was like a good time, upbeat kind of sound. But, and that was all formed after after Jamaica's independence. Independence happened, everyone's like, yeah, we're gonna get some now. And in the years that followed, it didn't pan out. The mood gets more militant, more politicized, and the music changes to reflect that. And that's how reggae came about, really.
And it's interesting, the whole country and western thing. You know, a lot of Jamaicans, of course, were listening to southern radio stations, so they were hearing the R&B, the soul, and also some of the great country stuff as well.
Country stuff. I'll tell you who was big in Jamaica, the Impressions, Curtis Mayfield. I'll tell you, sidetrack slightly. You know, everybody talks about rap, and they go, okay, rap, DJ Kool Herc. Actually, it comes from Jamaica with the Toasters and it. Do you guys know what I'm talking about? Yeah. Toasters and MCs. I interviewed the very first two Jamaican MCs, Toasters, DJs, whatever you want to call them. A guy called Count Matukey and King Stitt. They told me that they developed their style by listening to those American jocks broadcasting out of Miami with their high pop pickers jive talk. And they developed a style out of that for two reasons. Basically, well, for one main reason, because in those days they only played on one deck. So there's gaps between the records. So to keep the vibe going, they'd start with, you know, Jar, Rastafari, or whatever. So it came from them imitating white guys. That's how the lineage of rap ends up being where it is.
It's so interesting how things come around and
go
around.
And one thing I've learned about music is very little comes out of a void.
Absolutely.
And the stuff that does, you probably wouldn't like. You know, it's like Mongolian throat singers and things like that. I'm not dissing any Mongolians or anything, but anyway, sorry, go on.
So in the early 70s, I mean, what were you doing in the early 70s before you started, like, before the Clash picked up on you and everything?
Okay, early 70s. Interesting, I'm what they call first generation British born black. Kind of rolls off the tongue now, but trust me, back in the early 70s, it's a really confusing concept. You know, my parents had come over from Jamaica and they tried to play the white man and we saw that they were getting fucked over. And also we'd grown up, you know, with the whole civil rights movement going on. There's James Brown singing Say It Loud, I'm Black and I'm Proud. And we start to get politicized and militant. And luckily that coincided with the emergence of people like I-Roy and U-Roy, and particularly big youth in Jamaica. And so we were politicized through the music. And back then the music was it kind of helped you to be all you can be. It wasn't about trying to turn you into passive consumers. Music back then was about changing your mind. It wasn't about changing your sneakers. That makes sense. So, and the thing is, you know, I'm black British. I'm trying to work out where I fit. You know, we're looking to America, but we're not American. We're looking to Jamaica, but we're not really Jamaican. And we were like a lost tribe, you know. And then Bob Marley comes on the scene. And it's interesting because, you know, Bob Marley's of mixed parentage. He was a countryman that came to the city to look for his dream. Basically the opening scene of A Harder They Come. Any of you seen that film? If you ain't, check it out. And yeah, he came along at a time, I guess I was in my mid-teens, where I was hungry for information, inspiration, and some guidance as to where I fit within the scheme of things.
And so what did you actually discover? Where did you feel that you did eventually find that where you fit?
And I guess that would have come through the sound systems that were emerging in London at that time. And they were the hardcore, you know, things like, you might know, like Just Shaka and Coxsone sound and things like that. And they were like churches. I mean, not only did it, you know, we could kind of ease the pressure of the working week, but we got information that we weren't being told at school. You know, I only found out about Marcus Garvey through listening to a Burning Spear record. I wasn't being taught that at school, and why should I be? It was a white man's school. You got enough hassle teaching you kids anything. So yeah, it was through the sound systems. That's where I got my musical education.
Now, how did you started DJing reggae?
Yeah.
And can you tell me a little bit about that and how you came on the radar of people like Joe Strummer?
I'll try and keep this short, guys.
You don't
Okay.
have to keep it short.
So I'm on the Kings Road, Chelsea. I'm working in a shop. I've sort of said, fuck you to the system. I went to grammar school. My parents were really disappointed that I ended up working on a shop in Kings Road. This shop is called Acme Attractions. And this is just pre the whole punk thing. And there's two hip shops. There's Malcolm and Vivian's shop down one end, Sex, and my shop, Acme Attractions. And back in those days, these were the only places where sort of like-minded, disenfranchised youth could hang out, because the clubs back then didn't cater for us, you know. And us, I don't mean black people, I mean anybody that had something going on upstairs, basically. And this is like 74, 75. I'm playing what I like down the shop, hardcore dub reggae. The punk scene's just beginning to emerge. They don't like all the kind of hippie, overblown prog rock stuff that was going on then. It didn't relate to the feeling on the street. You know, they needed something that would get them through their working week, and the pressures, mid-70s was tough. You had the rise of National Front, you know, there was political strikes, unemployment, and as John would so eloquently put it later on, there was a general feeling of no future. Anyway, punk explodes because my white mates are trying to create a soundtrack that's relevant to their situation. They got a soundtrack, they got bands, they got nowhere to play. A friend of mine decides to open the very first punk rock venue in the UK, a club called the Roxy. He saw the reaction I was getting to the music I was playing in the shop, asked me to DJ, never DJ'd in my bloody life. Luckily for me, there weren't any UK punk records then. It's 1975, 76, 77. So I played what I liked, which was hardcore dub reggae, and lucky for me, punks loved it. They loved the anti-establishment vibe, they liked the bass lines, they like the musical reportage lyric of the lyrics, the quality of the lyrics, and they love the weed. Has to be said, I can't lie. I did try and slip in things that I thought related, Patti Smith, Television, Ramones, New York Dolls, MC5 Stooges. But funnily enough, the punks would say, look, leave that out, Don, just keep playing reggae. I later found out through a journalist called John Savage that one of the reasons they loved it so much, my reggae interludes in between the live punk acts, was because a lot of the live punk acts were shit. I mean, you know, luckily you get to hear about all the good ones, Clash, Slits, Banshees, Pistols, but a lot of them were fucking rubbish. So what I didn't realise was that when I was putting on my hardcore dub reggae with like nice sonics and everything, it was a really welcome break. But I don't want to underplay what happened in the Roxy, because there was a serious cultural exchange going on. We turned each other on through our mutual cultures. You know, I gave them the reggae and the bass line and the weed. What did they give me? They gave me and reggae, they gave me the DIY ethic, do it yourself, one of the most lasting legacies of punk rock, and they gave reggae exposure. And that's all it really needed, because the minute they gave reggae a bit of exposure, it just took off. And now, I mean, I don't know if you guys realise, you know, Jamaica, you look at a map of the world, it's a tiny little fucking, excuse my French, it's a tiny little island on a map, spent years under colonialisation. And in the 21st century, that tiny island has kind of culturally colonised the planet. You know, it's informed all Anglo-American music, has introduced a whole new musical vocabulary, and it's part of the, you know, even Lily Allen, that first Lily Allen album, reggae's all through that. You might not know it because you're too young, but I'm old enough to see the dots. So it's become part of the fabric of what you all are listening to this very day.
And
I hope, if you're in a bit of bass. I mean, because that's what, Jamaica's, I think, main gift to the world is bass culture. I mean, a lot of Western music before that, I mean, obviously there's bass lines in there, but it wasn't pushed to the front. It's about melody, it's about hooks, it's about guitars. Nothing wrong with that, Jamaicans love that too. But what we did is we pushed the drum and bass right up front. And also the other thing that I think we did was use the mixing desk as an actual instrument itself. I mean, through that whole thing came dub. Lee Perry, King Tubby. Do you want to know all this shit? Yeah. Good. Buy the records is all I can tell you. Hit me back before I go on and on.
No, that's great. The thing that I love about Britain having moved here is that I think it's the influence of Jamaican culture that has helped build some really indigenous music to Great Britain, such as drum and bass or dubstep.
Yeah.
And I think that probably started with the punks as well, kind of being able to cross-pollinate, so it wasn't just pure reggae anymore. That's kind of where it just started to overlap. I
mean, I think what's great about that whole punk thing is they took the essence of reggae and added a degree of self-interpretation. It wasn't slavishly copying it. I mean, listen to the Clash's version of Police and Thieves in the original, very different things. Actually, Lee Perry said they fucked it up. Truth be told. But then if you listen to the difference between the Sex Pistols album, You Ain't Got It, Get It, and Public Image, John's first solo efforts. And that's totally coming out of a kind of dub aesthetic, you know, there's a lot of space. Jar Wobble's bass lines are right up front. And another record you guys got to check out, especially the ladies, Slits, Cut. Incredible record. And I think those three acts, Pill, Clash and the Slits, were the best examples of that cross-pollinization.
And then you had Dennis Bovell, of course, producing
Dennis produced the Slits album.
Yeah, so that's some more kind of cross-pollination piece for those of you that
we were
don't
turning
know,
each other on through our respective cultures.
Yes, exactly, exactly.
Yeah. And became closer because of that.
And I think Big Audio Dynamite was also a reflection of that. I remember hearing it in the States. I worked in a record shop. And
they were looking at you like, what the hell is she talking about? Look at these people, they don't know Big Audio. Anybody heard of Big Audio Dynamite? No, you're too young.
Yay!
Okay.
John was in Big Audio Dynamite.
They don't care.
Jones.
I do. In a nutshell, I'll tell you very quickly. You've heard of the Clash, right? Mick gets kicked out of the Clash. He decides to start a new group, Big Audio Dynamite. Gets me involved. I had to point out I couldn't play anything, and he said, don't worry about that. Paul couldn't play anything either, and Paul learned by putting stickers on his bass. He eventually got rid of the stickers. In my whole 8 years with Big Audio Dynamite, I never got rid of the stickers. My keyboard had stickers on the whole time. But the idea of that band was to reflect the music that we're into. So we were into, you know, mixed rock and roll guitar. You know, we're into the beats coming out of hip hop in New York. Then there's a whole Jamaican bass line thing going on. And also I think the major thing that Big Audio Dynamite did is we were the first band to have a major hit with samples and dialogue. Like I say, you guys are too young to know what that means, but it was quite a big deal at the time. But it wasn't a kind of amalgamation of all these things that turned us on, which on paper sounds like it should have been a bloody mess, but it wasn't, it was just bad.
Now I'm going to back up a bit now to Bob Marley again. So he comes over to Britain, he was going, and actually to Sweden, to work with Johnny Nash.
That's right, and Johnny Nash brings him to the UK, they go on a tour, and then Johnny dumps them basically. They basically end up stuck in England. It's 1971 and they got no money to go home. Through, brain work. Basically, through a connection, they blagged $8 grand off Chris Blackwell to get back to Jamaica. And he said he'd give them the money if they delivered an album. And everyone's like, Chris, you're mad, you know, because they had a rude boy reputation. I mean, you know, Bunny Wailer, Peter Tosh and Bob, I mean, it must have been a formidable team. The thing about Chris Blackwell is he's of Jamaican descent, so he weren't fazed by this. And he trusted them. And Bob repaid that trust by returning, I think within a year, with the album. Pretty much, it was finished as far as Bob was concerned. A diamond in the rough, I think is how I describe it. Another interesting thing about it, it was delivered on 8 tracks.
Really?
Just 8 tracks. Tell you what's really funny is sometimes they didn't even use all 8 tracks. Do you guys want to know all this technical stuff? I mean, you know, they'd bounce all the drums onto one track. They'd put guitar and piano on one track. So that's what Chris had to work with. And the original album's actually out there in some deluxe version. And like I said, the songs were fully formed, but they were too hardcore for an international audience. I mean, reggae back then was kind of vilified by the rock audience. A situation that really weren't helped by the odd novelty records that got into the charts. You ain't gonna know any of this stuff, Fatty Boom Boom and Johnny Reggae. And that's what the rock audience thought reggae was about. So Chris had an uphill struggle to break this band. His genius was to sweeten these hard driving rhythms, because they were that. And his genius was to bring in, and this is something I didn't know till years after, two white guys. A guy called John Brain Work. John Rabbit Bundrick, and it's important I remember these names, they're really important. And Wayne Perkins of Muscle Shoals fame. And these were artists in their own right and session men. And it's their well, in case of Rabbit Bundrick, it's his keyboards, clarinet, synths you can hear all over the record. All that slide and steel guitar stuff, that's all Wayne Perkins. And I didn't know all this shit till years after, I gotta tell you. When I first heard Catch a Fire, we knew it sounded different. We weren't even sure what it was, but later on I worked out it was this stuff. It was input from these white guys. But when it came out, it was like a major revelation, I can't tell you, not only in the white rock world, but also in the reggae world. No one had got into this area of sonics and production before. I mean, this is years before Lee Perry's Super 8, a few years before Keith Hudson's Pick-a-Dub, which is like a really seminal dub album. And it's interesting, 'cause a lot of people say, oh, you know, they forced it on Bob. But I'm telling you, I knew Bob personally. I used to sell him weed. I don't do it now. But, and Bob, I tell you, no one could tell Bob, and certainly not Peter and Bunny, what to do. So basically, I mean, I think Bob described Chris as his translator. And some of this stuff I'm going to tell you, I got this gig to do this, and I thought, better be professional, do a bit of homework. And I watched a documentary, and if you're interested in this record, check it out, a documentary by Jeremy Marr about the making of Catch a Fire. But there's a bit where he's interviewing Rabbit Bundrick, the white keyboard player. And he's in the studio and he's playing something, and Bob comes in like, Bomberclot, Rasclot, the wrong brethren. And Bob basically would, you know, it wasn't like they came in and put this stuff on. Bob would direct him and say, yeah, this way or that way. So it wasn't anything that was forced on him. You know, but the whole idea was to sweeten it for a rock audience, and it worked.
It definitely works, and I think it also made Jamaica and reggae music like a whole worldwide phenomenon as well. But there was a big backlash in Jamaica, wasn't there?
Yeah, with all the purists in Jamaica like, oh no, Bob sold out and blah blah blah. But listen, you know, Bob and Jamaican artists, they didn't live in a bubble. You know, they were listening to white rock. They were listening to stuff that was coming out of the American stations broadcasting out of Miami. And they were hip to this stuff. It wasn't like he was turning them on to alien sounds. So, and Bob was eager to break. You know, I mean, Catch a Fire isn't when they came on the scene. They were already big in Jamaica, but they just had no profile on the international market. And they wouldn't have done with a record that they delivered at that time. Now, if you listen to the original record before Chris's overdubs, and these overdubs, I mean, what did I say? It was 8 tracks. By the time they finished overdubbing, 8 tracks was now 16 tracks. You know, which still ain't a lot compared to what they do today. Nowadays, they go up to what? 64 tracks and whatever you need. You know, Chris wanted it to have a kind of equity with the rock market, and that was in production and actual promotion of the album. The original sleeve, doesn't look like this. Yeah. Original sleeve is what they call a gatefold. Sleeve, album, record sleeve. Gatefold. Basically, it looked like a Zippo lighter, and it would open up like this. You know, so it looked like a lot of the rock albums at the time were doing gimmicky things, etc. And in fact, I think they only printed up like
20,000.
40,000, I think.
40,000?
Maybe, yeah.
I tried buying one recently, and it was 500 quid.
Really?
Yeah.
Shit.
So I wanted to get it.
I'll tell you what's interesting. So and the sleeve didn't have a picture of the band on the front, intentionally. And it's interesting that after the 40,000 copies that they did, this is how the record came out. And what the most interesting change was this. It became Bob Marley and The Wailers. The original Catch a Fire is credited as just The Wailers. And the truth of the matter is this record proved that The Wailers weren't a one-man show. You know, I mean, there's 2 songs on here that are written and sung by Peter. And I maintain, you know, that basically after they did Burning, the second album, Bunny and Peter left. The story is that Bunny left because he couldn't get his Ital food. Vegan food on the road, and he didn't like touring. I think that basically these 3 guys had such big egos that there was no way that they were going to be contained in this one band. And of course, Bunny went on to make some great records. If you're interested, there's an album called Black Heart Man, which you should check out. And then Peter, well, he went, you know, legalize it and all kinds of shit. So yeah, after the second album, they'd both left. But this record really is a testament to the fact that it wasn't a one-man show.
But why do you think Bob was singled out? I mean, you met the man. What kind of qualities did he possess that made him such an international star?
I was almost going to say he had X Factor. But he had what X Factor really is. if you know what I mean. I'm not talking about that shit on telly. He just had charisma. He had style. He had presence. And he was prepared to kind of make X amount of maneuvers to get to where he wanted to get to. I mean, you know, they had a tough time breaking America. I mean, they broke here pretty easily, basically because there was an Afro-Caribbean community that were open and receptive to the messages. And I got to say, it wasn't just the black community. I mean, the hip white guys were playing this record. The odd skinheads, and I've got to say skinhead, when I say skinhead, we're talking about the fashion version, not the fascist version that came out years later. So it found a market here, but in America they had a hard time, and I think he had to go on tour with people like Bruce Springsteen he went on tour with, and come on, brain, Sly and the Family Stone. And, but even then he had a hard time. I mean, basically then the white Americans started cottoning on. And this was a thing that really bothered Bob. I remember him actually telling me one time. And it wasn't until he went out on tour with Stevie Wonder years later that American blacks started to go, okay, you know, we can deal with this.
So you felt like American blacks were not really following him?
They didn't want to know where we were coming from. They were only concerned about where we would go, where they were going. And I can kind of dig that, you know.
Yeah,
but that was the toughest, of all the markets for Bob to break, it was the black American market. That was the toughest market for him to break.
Interesting. I didn't know that, actually. That's really interesting. Could you tell us a few words about what he was like as a person, maybe, in his more private life? Was he a quiet man, or was he gregarious?
He was definitely thoughtful. I remember the first time I met him. I went to see, what is it? Sorry guys, I'm old, my brain's frazzled from the journey. I went to see this gig, Lyceum, he played at Lyceum. And I'm little baby Don, I'm not the character that anybody knows, I'm like nobody, but I'm in little dreadlocks. And I've got in my car and I followed the coach to his hotel in Harrington Gardens and basically just blagged my way in with all the big Rasta guys. And they sat around the corner, all the English Rasta elders sat around the table with Bob to smoke weed and basically what they call reason, which is basically to talk. Anyway, it gets to about 3 o'clock in the morning and Bob's out smoked and out reasoned everybody. And he looks around the room and I'm sat in the corner with my pathetic little bag of weed. And he summons me to the table to sit down. I'd like to say to talk, but really he wanted to finish off my fucking weed. But I spent an hour with him as the sun came up, and the dude changed my life. You know, there's no two ways about it. I mean, if it wasn't for Bob and a few other people, I wouldn't be standing here in front of you today, because, you know, Bob showed me that I didn't have to play the white man. I could be somebody by being myself, and that's something that we desperately needed to be told back then, because, you know, the examples of making it as a black man back then were few and far between, trust me. You know, if you weren't crimping your hair and wearing a smart suit like the Motown guys, you didn't stand a chance. So, you know, yeah, without Bob, I wouldn't be standing in front of you.
Interesting. And why did you pick, out of all the Bob Marley albums, the Bob Marley The Wailers albums, why did you pick Catch a Fire to present today?
That's a good question. It's the only one I could remember. No, I'm kidding. I'm kidding. I made videos for Bob and everything. I made the One Love video, waiting for... Anyway, I picked it because it was a quantum leap for the music. When I say the music, I'm talking about reggae. It was a new and fresh start. Nothing before had sounded like that. And it opened the doors for things to begin to embrace elements of Western music without selling out. You know, it could maintain its integrity, be true to itself, but still be open to ideas that were coming from other places. In that tradition of, you know, like I said, nothing comes out of a void. You know, people, everything has kind of come from somewhere, and people added, you know, when the Stones came up with rock and roll, they were trying to copy American R&B. Most of the greatest rock and roll on this planet has been created through people's mistakes, you know. So, yeah, because it opened the floodgates, yeah, and created a new musical vocabulary. That's my story, and I'm sticking to it.
Well, I think we should have a listen to it.
Yeah, it'll be hanging, guys. I mean, it's a trip. You know.
It really is.
Yeah.
It really is. But don't forget, no talking. Yes.
Is there any chance I could just ask a question?
Absolutely.
Yeah, go on. Throw a few.
Well, I've actually got two. One, what's your favourite song?
I don't do that. I'm too old. Whatever. Don't do that.
Meteors coming to the earth.
But all music, eh?
Meteors coming to the earth. What would people think that you'd stick on the record player?
Probably what I'm going to play tomorrow.
Okay.
What's going on, Marvin Gaye? Probably.
And
Yeah.
second question, what's the funniest thing you saw Bob Marley ever do?
That's a good one.
funny. He was a joker. See, one thing, I don't do football, and he played football all the time, so I've missed all that. The funniest thing I ever saw him do, I don't know, I don't remember him being a joker. I gotta be honest. Oh, I know. I went with him carnival, the bastard. Oops, sorry, Bob. I went to the carnival with him, and he sent me off to get some weed. What a surprise. Came back, he's trying to chat up my old lady. That's it. Yeah. No, I'll tell you another one. The last one, I'll play the record. So it's 1977. Bob's living in London because he'd just been shot in Jamaica. He was literally in exile. And he's living in Oakley Street, a street of Chelsea. And like I say, I used to sell him weed. Anyway, I went round there one day to get some money he owed me, and I was wearing my bondage trousers. And he looks at me, and he's like, Don Letts, you look like one of them nasty blood clot punk rocker. English, Don Letts, you look like a nasty punk rocker. Basically, he'd been sort of reading the tabloid press, and they'd painted a very negative portrait of what the movement was about. Nihilism, swastikas, negativity. And it weren't about that. It was about empowerment, freedom, individuality. And I'm like, hold on a minute, what do you mean nasty punk rockers? And basically, we had a little argument where I was like, Bob, you're wrong, these are my mates. You know, there's something going on, brethren, you've got to listen to it. And he sort of basically said, piss off. And I'm like, all right, fuck you too. And I left in a huff. 2 months later, after he was a bit more informed about the whole thing, he wrote Punky Reggae Party. So I always figured I got the last laugh there. But it took a lot of bollocks to stand up and telling me he was wrong, I tell you. I never regret it. Yeah, I wasn't going to shit on my mates.
Yeah, exactly, exactly. Well, let's have a listen. That was a good question, by the way.
Thank you for your time, everybody.
So let's have a listen.